Thank you. I hope you've all got a handout. You'll need it to follow the stages of the argument. I hope you'll excuse an old-fashioned way of giving a lecture with the aid of this rather than that, and this rather than that. Right. Well, we normally think that when we perform intentional actions, that is to say, when we do things that we mean to do, our intentions cause and guide our movements. If I wave my hand intentionally, we normally think that it's an intention of mine is causing the brain events which cause the motion of my hand. And so for more sophisticated actions like coming to Krakow, we normally think that the movements of my body are directed, guided by my intentions. But some recent neuroscientists have claimed that they have proved otherwise, or at any rate got some substantial evidence to suggest that what happens in my brain is entirely unaffected by my mental life. Now, I'm going to show first that they haven't shown that, and secondly, that they couldn't show that, and thirdly, that no scientist could show that. So, to start, I start with some definitions. They're my definitions. People use these words, mental and physical, in different ways, but these are the ways I'm going to use them. I'm going to understand by a mental event one to which its subjects necessarily have privileged access, and a physical event as one to which there is no privileged access. I know better than you do, and necessarily am capable of knowing better than you do what thoughts I'm having at the moment, what sensations I'm having at the moment. Because whatever ways you can find out about what sensations I'm having, perhaps by my behavior, perhaps also by looking at my brain, I could use those ways to find it out. I could look at my behavior on a film. I could study my brain just as well as you can. But I have a further way of knowing about these things, that is to say, I experience them. And that, on my definition, makes it a mental event. On the other hand, a physical event, such as that there are quite a lot of people in this room, is something to which anyone can have equal access. There is no privileged person who necessarily knows that better than anybody else. So that's the distinction between the mental and the physical. Now, among the mental events, one must distinguish what I call pure mental events from others. The fact that I'm seeing that chair over there is a mental event, because I know better than anybody else whether I'm seeing the chair, because my mental life is involved and I have privileged access to it. But of course, I can't see the chair unless there is the chair there, and the presence of the chair is a physical event. So some mental events include physical events as parts of them, or the description of the mental event entails the physical event. But there are pure mental events, ones whose occurrence does not entail, in the logical sense, does not entail the occurrence of physical events. For example, it's seeming to me that I'm seeing a chair. That doesn't entail there's a chair there, and it doesn't entail anything particularly about my brain or behavior or whatever. Though, of course, reasonably you make inductions from that. I make inductions from that. But it's not part of what I'm saying when I say it seems to me that there's a chair there. And likewise, all our sensations, the patterns of color in our visual field, the noises we seem to hear in our head, the thoughts that pass through our mind, these are all pure mental events. They don't entail anything about what's going on in the brain. Maybe nothing's going on in the brain. It's logically compatible that nothing is going on in the brain. Among pure mental events, there are two classes. One, conscious events, that is to say, ones which necessarily, if I am having that event, I am conscious of having that event. Again, this is my definitions, and one or two things that you'll say are sensations in your sense I might be able to have without being conscious of them, but I'm going to use the word such that something is only a sensation if I'm aware of its occurring. And likewise, something is an occurrent thought that is passing through my mind, today is Thursday, only if I'm conscious of it. If I'm not conscious and I'm thinking today is Thursday, then I'm not thinking it. And among those conscious things are our intentions. We are aware of what at any rate it seems to us that we're doing, and that is to have an intention, to think that we're making a difference to the world in this way. But there are also pure mental events which we can have while we're not conscious of them, but what makes them mental is that we can become conscious of them in a way that the outsider can't. And our beliefs are like that. I have innumerable beliefs which I'm not conscious of at the moment, but I can become conscious by reflecting what do I think about so-and-so. And so too are our desires in the sense of our inclinations to do certain things, to be distinguished from our intentions, which are our attempts to realize certain things. Right, given those definitions, the thesis I'm concerned with can be put in a little more precise and fuller way as the thesis of epiphenomenalism, and that is on your handout, the doctrine that no conscious events, and among them no intentions, but other conscious events as well, no conscious events cause physical events, and of course brain events are physical events, and that is the doctrine I am concerned with. Now, it looks as if this is, and indeed I think it is, a scientific theory in the sense that it's a theory about what causes what. That is to say, it's a theory that insofar as brain events are caused, they're caused by other physical events. It's a theory about what causes what, and that, if anything, is surely a scientific theory. So if it's a scientific theory, it's got to, if we're to be justified in believing it, we've got to have certain evidence for it. And one absolutely vital condition for a scientific theory, it's reasonably said, is that it shall make true predictions. And we can't be justified in believing a scientific theory unless we're justified in believing that it makes true predictions. Okay, and these are predictions of particular events. So, what are our grounds for supposing that, what kind of grounds do we have for supposing that some scientific theory, any scientific theory, makes true predictions? Well, we might actually observe the thing which is predicted. It may stare us in the face. Alternatively, we might think we remember it. I remember having seen so-and-so. Or more likely, most of our knowledge of whether scientific theories make true predictions is based on testimony, the testimony of those who themselves claim to have made these predictions, and write it up in a journal. Now, I'm suggesting to you that there are three fundamental epistemic principles here, that in each case we are, if it seems to us that we're observing something or experiencing something, then it's rational, we are justified in believing that we do in the absence of apparent counter-evidence. So, and this is a general form of a principle which I mentioned on the handout, the first one there, the principle of credulity. That if it seems to you you are having certain experiences, then you ought to be then you're justified in believing you do. If it seems to you you're observing a chair or a lot of people in this room or hearing a noise, then you're justified in believing that you do, in the absence of counter-evidence to suppose you've been subject to some sort of illusion. So, as it were, our data are our apparent experiences, and I suggest to you we are justified in taking our apparent experiences at their face value in the absence of counter-evidence. And if you think that's a doubtful principle, think about, you wouldn't know anything about the world at all unless you did think that. If you thought, well, I can't be really certain I've seen a chair just because I think I've seen a chair, I need further evidence, because what would the further evidence consist in? It would consist in somebody telling me they'd seen a chair, and but then I've got to believe I've actually heard them say that, and if I can't really trust my experiences without further evidence, then I couldn't believe that. And so it's a basic principle. We must believe that things are as they seem to be, especially with regard to our experience, in the absence of counter-evidence. And a second principle, which really follows from that, is the principle of memory, that it seems to us, if we apparently remember having done certain things or having experienced certain things, then we're justified in believing that we have in the absence of counter-evidence. Again, if you say, well, we need some sort of experimental evidence to show that memory works, the trouble is the experimental evidence would itself depend on memory, and unless you start from there, you get nowhere. The third principle is an independent principle, I think. That is to say, you can believe the first two without believing the third, but if you don't believe the third, we know pretty little about the world. And the third is the principle of testimony, that you should believe what people tell you in the absence of counter-evidence. Again, almost all our knowledge of geography, history, science, and so on depends on what people tell us. And if we're not justified in believing that unless we've got other evidence, again, the other evidence would have to come from what people tell us. So it's a fundamental principle which I suggest is rational if we're to have knowledge of the world. Put another way, apparent experiences are probably true as such, apparent memories are probably true as such, apparent testimony is probably true as such. As such, that is to say, barring counter-evidence. Counter-evidence comes in the form of what some philosophers call defeaters. Defeater shows that although it may seem to you that you remember so-and-so, that is no evidence for so-and-so. And there are two forms of defeaters. There are undermining defeaters and there are overriding defeaters. An undermining defeater is like this. It seems to you that, for example, you remember so-and-so, having done so-and-so, having seen so-and-so, and you believe so-and-so because you believe that you remember having seen so-and-so. Now, an undermining defeater would be one that shows that what you're relying on in getting to your conclusion either in fact didn't happen or is no evidence for your conclusion. Thus, if I claim to have if I claim that John was in London because I claim that I remember having seen him in London, but you point out to me that I wasn't in London at the time, so I couldn't possibly have seen him, that would be an undermining defeater. Or alternatively, if you point out to me, although you were in London, you don't know what John looks like, and so your experiences are no reason to suppose that you've seen John in London, that is also an undermining defeater. An undermining defeater for a belief in X is not evidence that X didn't occur, it's just evidence that your supposed evidence that X did occur isn't to be trusted. Undermining defeaters mean that the claims of apparent experience, apparent memory, apparent testimony are not to be taken at face value, are not to be believed without further stages. By contrast, an overriding defeater is just evidence, independent evidence, evidence independent of your experience, that what you seem to remember or somebody tells you they saw didn't actually occur. If I remember, if I believe that John was in London on the basis of my memory that I saw him in London, then as we've seen, the undermining defeater would be evidence that I wasn't in a position to see him in London. But an overriding defeater would be evidence that he wasn't in London, he was somewhere else. It shows independently that what I believe on the basis of experience, etc., is false. Okay, now I'm concerned almost entirely with undermining defeaters, defeaters which show that apparent experience, etc., aren't evidence of what they appear to be evidence of. And in the case of all of these sources of evidence about the occurrence of particular events, in each case there is a causal assumption. The assumption is that when we observe something, say the chair over there, why we trust our apparent perception, as we think it's really is a perception, we think we are justified in trusting our apparent perception, is because we also believe that our belief is caused by the chair. That is to say, it's the chair being there, light rays coming off it is the way we now interpret the causal root, but long before people believe that, they would have to believe that it's the presence of the chair which causes us to have the belief that the chair is there. Likewise with memory. If you trust your memory that you were in London, then you believe that your being in London, your experience of being in, you believe that your being in London caused you to have the experience of being in London, which is relying on the justification of experience, and that your experience of being in London caused your present memory that you were in London. Likewise with testimony, if somebody said, I saw John in London, then you believe him because you believe that the experience of seeing John in London was in fact his experience of seeing John in London was caused by John being in London, and his experience is what has led him, has caused him to be in a position to give you this information. In each case, there is an assumption of a causal root, and you can see that by seeing the cases. And if it's shown to you that there isn't this causal root, then you have an undermining defeater for your resulting belief. For example, if I apparently see in a theatre a woman being sawn in half, then I am right to believe that I have seen a woman in half in the absence of defeaters. And of course this is a rather bad example because there are overriding defeaters as well as undermining ones. But an undermining defeater would be evidence that the apparent experience of seeing this was caused by something quite other than the woman being sawn. It was caused by a particular arrangement of mirrors or something like that. And likewise, if you any illusion produced, however, for example, an illusion produced by mirrors that, produced by mirrors anyway, of anything, that might be an illusion that there are vast numbers of people in this room caused by all sorts of reflections off mirrors. And if I come to believe that there are lots and lots of more people than there are in the room on the basis of some illusion produced by mirrors, and then somebody points out to me that why I believe this is not because there are lots and lots of people in the room, but because a particular arrangement of mirrors would give me this apparent belief, then the belief that there are lots of mirrors is undermined. Or again, if I claim to have seen John in London and it's shown to me that John's identical twin was in London, then my experience could have been that I believe he's in London could have been caused other than by his being in London. And so that undermines my belief on the basis of it. So always there is this causal assumption, and if it's shown that the causal assumption doesn't hold, e.g. there isn't a causal link of the kind I mentioned, a causal link between the experience and between the object apparently experienced and my apparent experience of it, a causal link between my past apparent experience and my present apparent memory, or a link between somebody else's testimony and their apparent memory. If it's shown that any of these causal links don't hold, then that's evidence that the belief, that shows the belief is not justified. Right. Okay, these are principles that I will rely on. Note that the defeaters themselves must arise from also what I seem to see, what I seem to remember, what somebody seems to tell me on the basis of testimony. It's just that some beliefs based on one of these sources can be defeated by other beliefs, possibly stronger ones, based on the same kind of sources. And therefore, if we are to be justified in believing some scientific theory, we must be justified in believing that it makes true predictions, that it makes certain predictions, and that those predictions are actually true. They came off. And our belief in both of these things, that it did make certain predictions and that these predictions succeeded, belief in both of these things must depend on memory, apparent experience, memory, and testimony. There's no other way to get them. And if the belief that we get in this way isn't justified, and if we can't get any beliefs in this way which are justified, then we're not justified in believing the theory. And this, what I have now been saying the last 10 minutes or so, is summarized in my epistemic assumption, EA, which is at the bottom of your handout. Just ignore the phrases in brackets for the moment. I'll come to them in due course. A justified belief in a scientific theory requires a justified belief that the theory makes true predictions. A justified belief that the theory makes true predictions is provided by and only by evidence of apparent experience and memory that the theory predicts certain events and that these events occurred. Such justification is undermined by evidence that any apparent experience was not caused by the event apparently experienced, any apparent memory was not caused by the apparent experience of the event apparently remembered, and any apparent testimony was not caused by the testifier's intention to report the apparent experience or memory. I try and bring these together and detect a fundamental criterion underlying them, which I call FC and is at the top of the next page. And that is that justified belief that some event occurs requires the assumption that the event is one to which the believer has privileged access or causes effects to which the believer has privileged access. That is, in all these cases, either if your justified belief is about the sensation you're now having, then this is something to which you have privileged access, but otherwise you depend on a belief that the event you're now having, the one to which you have privileged access, has been caused by the event in which you believe. Okay, and therefore, if we'd have justified belief in any scientific theory, we do have to have justified belief in it's both that it predicts certain events and that those events occur. Now then, coming back to epiphenomenalism in the light of these epistemic principles. There are two kinds of evidence which would show, or might at stage one seem to show, that epiphenomenalism was true. I'm going to call these two kinds of evidence alpha-type evidence and beta-type evidence. Alpha-type evidence would be evidence that whether or not certain brain events occur is entirely independent of any mental events. Thus, if you were to show, for example, that for innumerable different samples of brain events, sequences of brain events, and I'm marking brain events by B's, will lead to certain actions, certain bodily movements, and that this happens independent of whether any mental event is there, and the mental event might, let's see, be an intention. And if you could show that for innumerable sequences of brain events, especially those involved in intentional actions, it made no difference whether somebody formed an intention or not, then you would have shown that indeed epiphenomenalism was true. But you can see that if that is to be shown, there is a prediction that this will happen whether or not that happens. And therefore you have to, as it were, run the sequence twice. You have to show that it happens and that it continues to happen even if the intention is formed. In order to have this prediction, you have to know whether or when someone has formed an intention. And how can you know that? Well, of course, they tell you, perhaps, or maybe if it's your own intention, you remember it. But you will recall that the assumption here is that we are justified in believing what someone tells us only on the assumption that there is a causal route from what they tell us from what they report to their testimony, and thereby to our belief. But if I rely on someone's testimony to when he formed an intention, I am assuming that that intention causes brain events in him, which causes the words to come out of his mouth. But if epiphenomenalism was true, generally true, that couldn't possibly happen, because that wouldn't make any difference to what happens here. So I can't get evidence by testimony, because I can only get evidence by testimony on the assumption that epiphenomenalism is false. So there can't be any evidence coming from testimony to show that it's true. Well, perhaps I might remember myself, even if I can't tell anyone else, as it were. I might remember myself after the event that I had this memory, and that would perhaps give me evidence that in my case it didn't make any difference to this whether or not the memory occurred. But then, as we know from neuroscience itself, the way any memory causes any past intention, say that causes the memory of that intention, and let's call that M4, memory of that intention, is because this lays down a trace in the brain which causes the subsequent memory. So again, if epiphenomenalism were true, that couldn't happen, because if epiphenomenalism were true, that can't cause a change in the brain to make it happen. So you might say, well, you could know that it was you could know that this was happening if you were actually experiencing it at the time. Well, that's true, but if the only bit of evidence you can have for epiphenomenalism is that at the time a certain sequence of events is occurring, you actually there notice that you're having a memory. This is one piece of evidence about one person which only lasts a second or two, and that's no evidence for a scientific theory. So the obvious conclusion for this is that this sort of evidence is never going to establish epiphenomenalism. Not that a particular research program hasn't quite done it, but this theory couldn't ever do it. Now, the obvious application is to the Libet type experiments with which many of you will be familiar, possibly more familiar than I am. But you will know that Benjamin Libet started a kind of experiment on which was entitled Experiment into Whether People Have Free Will, which is not something I'm going to discuss, but it was seen by him and his followers as showing something else a little narrower. And the something else that it was seen as showing was that at any rate in the particular experiments he did, the mental had no effect on the brain. And I summarize on the second page of the handout those experiments. Just to remind you what they consisted in. They consisted in sitting a lot of students at desks, putting a lot of electrical apparatus on their heads so that this could measure the electric potential on their skull, and telling them, right, you're to move your hand at a moment of your choice when you freely choose to in the next 20 seconds. And you ought to note on a very fast clock, and each of them were given a very fast clock in front of them, you ought to note the exact moment on that clock at which you formed the intention to move your hand. And they did that, and then it was discovered that about half a second, 400 milliseconds, before the time at which a given student claimed to have formed an intention, there was a build-up of electric potential on the skull, which was clearly evidence of a particular kind of event happening in the brain. And what they concluded from that is that for any formation of an intention, and I mark M2 meaning that it's later than M1, and B3 meaning that it's later than M2, there was 400 milliseconds here between those two, and 150 milliseconds between those two, that is to say between this and when something in the brain started off the movement of the hand. Now, I find this rather extraordinary, but quite a lot of neuroscientists said the fact that this is clearly correlated with this shows that that has nothing to do with it. And that therefore the mental doesn't make a difference, or intentions don't make a difference to the brain. That's a quite extraordinary conclusion when you think of it, since the obvious explanation was this causes that causes that. But I mean, if I turn on a switch and the light goes on, and somebody says, well, if there's this correlation between turning the switch and the light going on, then that shows that it's nothing to do with the electricity in the wires between them. That would clearly be an unjustified conclusion, but it's the sort of conclusion that a lot of neuroscientists did in fact make. However, barring that, therefore they wanted to say, or whether or not they actually committed themselves to that, they wanted to say that really that caused a brain event which caused that, and this was irrelevant. Now, what therefore rule did it have? Well, the suggestion is that this caused the mental event, the apparent intention, and this caused the movement of the hand, but really that had no effect on that. Well, that's entirely unjustified by their particular experiments, but what I have wanted to show to you is it's entirely unjustifiable by any experiment, because the only evidence you can have about that is going to come from evidence on this that assumes that every phenomenalism is false. So it's self-defeating in this respect. If the kind of evidence you rely on is that which I call alpha-type evidence, that is evidence that evidence about when relative to brain events, mental events occur. Now, I'm going to stop at this point. There is a further development, which I shall get to, I hope, by the time I'm meant to finish. But I think it would be useful if we have 5 or 10 minutes of questions at this stage, just in case you haven't understood the main argument. Perhaps you can confine yourself to questions of understanding to start with. Could we have, if anybody hasn't followed anything there, I'd be grateful if you'd ask. All crystal clear? All right, I'll go in that case, make the final pitch and then let you object. Now, I've said alpha-type evidence, and this is evidence about when, relative to brain events, the mental events occur. Now, you might try and justify epiphenomenalism in a different way without relying on any evidence about mental events, at least apparently without relying on any evidence about mental events. You might study large numbers of sequences of brain events, and perhaps more generally sequences of physical events, and establish a theory of physical determinism. That is, physical determinism is the theory that every physical event, including brain events, is caused by and only by another physical event. And this would involve claiming that each physical event has an immediately precedent physical event, which is a necessary and sufficient condition for it. I stress immediately precedent because if this is a necessary and sufficient condition for that, and that's a necessary and sufficient condition for that, then it's still the case that the mental interferes with the brain, even if each brain event has a necessary and sufficient condition as a brain event. However, you might think you could establish simply by studying brain events, or physical events generally, that there was this determinism in the brain. And if that was so, then of course mental events are not going to interfere with brain events, because brain events occur simply because of other brain events which have their necessary sufficient conditions, so mental events can't make a difference to it. Well, how are you going to go about that? Well, you're going to proving that. You're going to go about it by selecting large numbers of samples of this and inventing some scientific theory, physical determinist theory, which makes predictions. Once again, the question arises, how are you going to know these predictions occurred? And if you take EA as opposed to FC, you take EA, then of course you're not going to have it that, because people are going to tell you what they saw, and you're going to remember what you remember having seen. And you can only take that as evidence if what you remember having seen caused a brain trace, which caused you to remember it, or if someone's testimony to you was caused by their intention to tell you something, and therefore, once again, their intention caused the words to come out of their mouth. But you might stretch the understanding of memory and testimony in such a way that it might seem that you could avoid this problem. Now, memory, as I've represented it, is memory of one's own past experience. I remember having seen this, or I remember having done this. But you could understand memory not as memory of one's own experiences, but as memory of what was experienced. That is to say, you might remember that there were 20 people in this room, rather than just remembering that you saw that. And if your memory is of particular events as opposed to particular experiences of events, then of course you can have it without it being caused by an experience, and therefore all the problems which I've suggested arise. And after all, we do use memory sometimes in this sense, because we talk of people remembering some past event, or some feature of a past event, which hadn't occurred to them it had at the time. You may remember having seen some people there, and then long after the event, you may remember that one of them was wearing a yellow hat, when that wasn't really part of your experience at the time. So you can stretch your understanding of memory a bit. And further bigger stretch, you could stretch your understanding of testimony a bit. And testimony, as I've represented it, is somebody intending to tell you something. But if you understood testimony simply as words coming out of someone's mouth, then the causal route wouldn't have to go through their mental life. And if you did understand that, there could be a causal route to your knowledge of which events had occurred without that causal route going through somebody else's or your own past experience and then coming downwards to the physical. And so you could, or somebody else could, observe brain events, and this could set up some state in their brain, and that state in their brain could cause them to utter certain words, and that would be a causal sequence which didn't rely on subject's mental life. And you could find out about the sequence and you could find out which events happened if you're prepared to stretch your understanding of memory, which seems all right, testimony, which seems a bit doubtful, in this way. And I won't go through the detail, but you can see that, in fact, FC, as I represent it, would allow you to do that, whereas EA would not. But now there is this catch. The catch is this. In order to know that, to be justified in believing that a scientific theory makes true predictions, you don't have to know merely what events happened. You have to know that those events were predicted by the theory. And how do we know that? In the case of a theory of any complexity, well, you might be a brilliant scientist and it might stare you in the face knowing the axioms of the theory that this follows from it. At that time, it might. More likely, for any complicated scientific theory, it takes a bit of time and so on to work it out. And therefore, you would be dependent on your memory of the earlier stages and your belief that you'll reach the later stages on the basis of what you remember in the earlier stages. That does involve a downward causal route, a causal route from the mental to the physical, which causes your present memory. And worse still, in fact, in almost all of these cases, we rely on the expert testimony of scientists to claim that their theory makes this prediction. And that involves their testimony not to an event, some physical event having happened, but their testimony to themselves having a certain sort of mental event, a mental event, conscious mental event, that they realized that this followed from that, and so on. And therefore, that too depends on the assumption that epiphenomenalism is false, that is to say, that the mental causes the physical. So you couldn't even establish have a justified belief in a physical deterministic theory without assuming that epiphenomenalism is false. So you could never prove epiphenomenalism, and any attempts to justify particular results from Libet experiments to suggest this are not merely don't work, but couldn't possibly work. And so that's my claim. For which I may well have exceeded my time.
Thank you very much. I'd like to draw you out on something that you hinted at, but I think didn't go as far with as you might have. First of all, I think we're in agreement that if epiphenomenalism is true, there really are no actions. What you see here is bodily movement, but if it isn't causally grounded in intentionality, it isn't really doing something in the way of action. But that goes too quickly toward your result, which is that what looks like testimony isn't action at all, and without testimony as action, we can't have evidence for epiphenomenalism. Now, the question I want you to help us with is this. Why can't the hardcore materialists say that if intentions are mental and not reducible to the physical, then we really don't need testimony as long as we have what you acknowledged we could have, behavior asserting certain things. So we might go like this. I see 2 rows of chairs before me. That causes my brain to go in an informational state. My brain has a memorial capacity. My brain has a sort of communicative capacity such that if you ask me how many rows of chairs there are before me, as a result of what's stored in my brain, I say, this isn't action now, but it's linguistic behavior, that there are 2 chairs. So reliability is preserved, and that's all we need for justification for believing a scientific hypothesis. I think you went in the direction of answering this objection, but you didn't quite give us the reply.
Our normal grounds for believing testimony is that We believe that the subject concerned has a belief which he is intending to convey to us. The moment we suspect he doesn't believe that, or he's not intending to convey us, we don't believe what he says. I mean, there are cases of where words come out of subjects' mouths which we don't think they're intending to, as in fluid aphasia or Tourette's syndrome, when all sorts of words come out of the chap's mouth which he certainly never intended should come. And when we realize that's the situation, then we don't believe any sentences which he's uttered. And that is part of our understanding of what testimony amounts to.
I find what you've said phenomenologically unassailable. But I think the problem is that the hard-nosed materialist will say, all we need is an understanding of semantically meaningful linguistic behavior, and if its content comes reliably from the facts, then that content can give us knowledge, never mind whether intention has any causal power.
Yeah, well, that comes on to what I was saying at the end. That is to say, the situation might well be satisfied for, if we drop our normal assumptions about the nature of testimony, might well be satisfied, thereby we could know what happened. But what we couldn't know without him telling us about our mental life is that his theory predicts what will happen. And that he's got to evidence, I saw it. That the scientist's got to tell us, I worked it out and I could see that it worked. And that's what couldn't happen without the downward route.
Thank you. I'm a little disappointed to let Professor go first because he took like 60% of my question and it will look creepy without this 60%. But I will repeat it in a little bit different way. I think we make three claims. One, easily to be defeated. Second, possible to be defeated. And the third, the strongest. The first one, when you mentioned the moments in which certain events happen with mental even in between, you just say, it's obvious it has to take part in this cause-effect chain. And there is a counterexample, a locomotion. It makes the whistle. Let's say there is some moment when someone presses the button or puts the decal inside, then it makes the whistle, and then it moves. We know that putting coal inside the engine has the causal effect of move, but the whistle, which is in between in time, has no causal effect on the move.
Yeah.
Therefore, that's kind of analogy which shows it is possible to claim.
Oh, of course it's possible. The question is whether one is justified in believing it on the basis of the evidence. And if all you know is that this occurred, and then this occurred, and then that occurred, the natural assumption would be that. But my argument doesn't depend on that. This was just a detailed criticism of what I regarded as far too general a conclusion from particular Libet experiments. My point is the strongest Libet experiment would be the one of showing that a sequence of brain events occurred whether or not a mental event occurred. That's what the people in this tradition ought to be trying to do, and maybe they will one day. But my point is even that wouldn't do the job.
Well, that was the easiest case to be defeated on my side. Another case is, can we ask for reports ignoring or even presuming that there will be no mental states taking part in it? Imagine a computer that is able to use language. It would be like a kind of zombie in David Chalmers' terms. And you can ask the computer whether its circuits are in fine condition. And let's say it is in hardware and software able to control its own physical state. It might tell you like, Mr. Swinburne, I'm fine.
Yeah.
You can ask for reports without necessarily assuming there be mental states.
Yes, but your only reason for trusting the computer is you think someone has programmed it in such a way that it will utter what we, with our understanding of language, will regard as true sentences. And therefore, you are relying on the programmer and the issue. And yes, this is a way of finding out information, but it's not a way of having anything to do with this sort of experiment, because unless we have any reason to believe that the computer has a mental life. If the computer doesn't have a mental life, then it's irrelevant to all this. If the computer does have a mental life, then the same problems arise.
Well, and the third point, which I say, this is your strongest point, you can't have a theory about mental states. So those scientists at least must presume that they have mental states to be able to construct a theory. So they might be true about other people, but not about themselves as authors of theories. And here I agree totally.
You better stop me when you ought to stop me.
I have a question on a more basic level. You mentioned the determinism standpoint, but as far as I know, I'm not very learned, but as far as I know, everything on atomic and subatomic levels behaves deterministically. So, at which point are there any building blocks for anything other than determinism?
Did you say, in your view, everything behaves deterministically?
On the atomic level and the subatomic level. So where is the point when we have something that can behave undeterministically?
Yeah, I wasn't discussing the question of well, let's put it, I don't think that's the correct report of science. My view is that quantum theory shows exactly the opposite. But it doesn't matter whether it does or not. My point is that if science is to establish a deterministic theory, it has got to do so on the scientists have got to calculate what its consequences are. And we can only believe them if we believe that when they tell us this is its consequences, we're justified in believing them. And we're only justified in believing them on the assumption that the words are coming out of their mouth because they intended to record a belief, the intention and the belief both being mental. So that's my point. Whether or not determinism is true is not something I have considered. I've considered it, I've written about it, but not in this lecture. What this lecture shows is we couldn't justifiably believe physical determinism, but it's perfectly compatible with psychophysical determinism. That is a belief that there's a deterministic theory showing how brain events cause mental events, cause brain events, and so on. That is perfectly compatible with what I've said. I don't think it's true, but it's not what I've discussed.